Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome back to the Islamic SHAHADA channel. In the heart of Europe lies a country that defies the continent's dominant image of cathedrals, secular democracies, and centuries of Christian tradition. That country is Albania, a small Balkan nation where the majority of people identify as Muslim. When most Europeans think of Islam, their minds turn outward, to the Middle East, to North Africa, to distant lands beyond the Mediterranean. Few realize that within the borders of Europe itself, in the rugged mountains and quiet valleys of the Western Balkans, Islam has been part of daily life for more than 5 centuries. Albania sits between Greece to the south, Montenegro and Kosovo to the north, and across the Adriatic Sea from Italy, a bridge between East and West, both geographically and culturally. Its cities, from Tirana to SHAHADA, tell a layered story of civilizations: Roman ruins beside Ottoman mosques, medieval churches facing modern skyscrapers. This is a nation shaped by empire, resistance, and reinvention. For centuries, Albania stood at the crossroads of 2 worlds, the Christian West and the Islamic East. Yet, unlike its neighbors, Albania's historical experience led to a quiet but profound transformation. Islam, once brought by the Ottomans, did not remain a foreign faith. It became a local identity, woven into the rhythms of Albanian life, language, and national consciousness. And yet, in modern Europe, this reality is often overlooked. Albania rarely appears in conversations about Islam in the West. Its people are European, its geography undeniably Western, but its faith challenges the continent's dominant narrative of religious homogeneity. Today, as Europe grapples with questions of identity, migration, and multiculturalism, Albania stands as a living paradox. A European nation whose majority is Muslim, yet whose culture remains deeply pluralistic and tolerant. How did this happen? How did a small, mountainous country on the edge of the Adriatic, once among the most isolated in the world, become home to Europe's forgotten Muslim majority? To understand Albania's story is to explore more than just a nation's faith. It is to uncover how Islam, in the heart of Europe, survived empires, communism, and globalization, and continues to shape a people's quiet resilience in the 21st century. To understand the story of Islam in Albania, one must first travel back to an age before minarets pierced the Balkan skyline, to a time when the region lay under the shadow of Byzantium and Rome. For much of the Middle Ages, the lands that now form modern Albania were a borderland, a zone of shifting powers, where the Eastern Orthodox world of Constantinople met the Roman Catholic influence spreading from the Adriatic coast. Religion, at that time, was as much political as it was spiritual. The Orthodox faith dominated the south and east, while Catholicism shaped the mountainous north, both serving as extensions of imperial authority rather than national identity. By the 14th century, the Albanian principalities found themselves caught between declining Byzantine control and the rising threat of a new empire from Anatolia, the Ottomans. When Ottoman armies reached the Balkans in the mid-15th century, they did not merely arrive as conquerors. They brought with them a comprehensive system of governance, law, trade, and education that would reshape the region's cultural and religious landscape for centuries. The Ottoman conquest of Albania, completed by the late 1400s, introduced Islam gradually rather than forcefully. Conversion was neither immediate nor uniform. In the beginning, Islam appealed primarily to the Albanian elite, nobles, administrators, and military officers who entered the Ottoman bureaucracy. Embracing Islam opened doors to social mobility, land ownership, and positions of influence within the vast imperial structure. Over time, this top-down transformation filtered into rural society, as peasants, merchants, and artisans began adopting the faith for both practical and spiritual reasons. Yet this process was not simply one of political convenience. As Ottoman rule stabilized, Islam became deeply rooted in the everyday life of Albanians. The empire's emphasis on community, charity, and education allowed Islam to integrate organically into local traditions. Mosques, Sufi lodges, tekke, and Quranic schools began appearing across the countryside, blending Islamic architecture with distinctly Balkan forms. Within 2 centuries, Islam was no longer a foreign import. It had become an Albanian faith. By the 17th century, a majority of Albanians had embraced Islam, marking one of the most significant religious transformations in European history. The coexistence of Muslims, Catholics, and Orthodox Christians within the same towns and even the same families created a unique culture of pluralism. It was not unusual for Muslim and Christian Albanians to share holidays, intermarry, and participate in each other's rituals, a testament to a society shaped by pragmatism rather than dogma. At the heart of this historical transformation stands one of Albania's most complex figures, Gjergj Kastrioti, known to the world as Skanderbeg. Once an Ottoman-trained commander who converted to Islam as part of imperial service, Skanderbeg famously returned to Christianity to lead a rebellion against Ottoman rule in the 1440s. His defiance made him a national hero and a symbol of Albanian resistance, celebrated both by Christian Europe and by secular nationalists centuries later. Yet his life also reflects the layered and often ambivalent relationship Albanians had with empire, faith, and identity. For many, his dual legacy, both as a Muslim soldier and Christian liberator, mirrors Albania's broader historical duality. Over the next 400 years, Islam would become a defining feature of Albanian identity. It was not merely a matter of religious belief, but of cultural continuity, a thread linking Albanians to the broader Islamic world, from Istanbul to Cairo. Through Ottoman patronage, Albanian scholars, poets, and administrators rose to prominence across the empire. Notably, several Ottoman Grand Viziers, including Köprülü Mehmed Pasha and his descendants, were of Albanian origin, shaping the politics of the empire from within. By the time Ottoman authority began to wane in the 19th century, Islam in Albania had already transcended its imperial roots. It had become part of the nation's social fabric, visible in its architecture, reflected in its values of hospitality and community, and embedded in the rhythms of daily life. Thus, when Albania eventually sought independence in 1912, it did so not as a Christian or Muslim state, but as a nation forged at the intersection of both. A country whose history could not be separated from the Ottoman crescent that had once illuminated its path. Islam, by then, was not a foreign mark upon Albania's past. It was the essence of its historical evolution, a faith that had survived empire, rebellion, and reform to become a quiet cornerstone of the Albanian soul. When Albania declared its independence in 1912, it faced not only the challenge of building a new state, but also of defining who it was. For centuries, its people had lived under Ottoman rule, their social, political, and religious life deeply intertwined with the empire and Islam. Yet independence arrived at a moment when Europe was reshaping itself around national identities rooted in language, ethnicity, and often Christianity. Albania, a Muslim-majority country at the edge of Europe, stood at a difficult crossroads between East and West, tradition and modernity, faith and nationalism. The newly formed Albanian leaders understood that aligning too closely with Islam might isolate the country from Western Europe, where the Ottoman Empire was still a major power. Legacy was viewed with suspicion. But to deny their Islamic heritage entirely would have meant erasing centuries of cultural and social history. The solution was something uniquely Albanian, a form of secular nationalism that neither rejected nor fully embraced religion, but placed Albanianness, the shared language, customs, and blood, above all else. This ideology, known as Feja e Shqiptarit Eshte Shqiptaria, the religion of the Albanian is Albanianism, became a defining feature of the new state. Coined by the national poet Pashko Vasa in the late 19th century, the phrase reflected a collective desire to transcend sectarian divisions that had long fractured the Balkans. In practice, it meant that Muslim, Orthodox, and Catholic Albanians were united not by creed, but by nationhood. The early 20th century saw this philosophy take institutional form. Albania's 1928 constitution established the state as secular, separating religion from government affairs while guaranteeing freedom of belief. Yet Islam remained an integral part of Albanian cultural life. The Muslim community of Albania, Komuniteti Musliman i Shqiperisë, was organized in 1923, becoming one of the first independent Islamic institutions in Europe, separate from Ottoman authority. The move symbolized a new era. Islam was no longer the religion of empire, but the faith of an independent European people. Cultural traces of this Islamic past continued to shape Albania's identity in subtle yet profound ways. The Albanian language, though stripped of Ottoman Turkish vocabulary during linguistic reforms, retained expressions and idioms rooted in centuries of Islamic civilization. The country's architecture, from the elegant domes of Berat and Elbasan to the Sufi tekke, lodges scattered in rural valleys, stood as living archives of a fusion between Balkan craftsmanship and Islamic aesthetics. Equally influential was the Bektashi order, a Sufi movement that had taken deep root in Albania since the Ottoman period. By the 20th century, the Bektashis had become a bridge between Islam and secular modernity. Known for their emphasis on tolerance, humanism, and symbolic interpretation of scripture, the Bektashi ethos resonated strongly with a population eager to balance faith and reason. Albania would later become the global center of the Bektashi community after Turkey's secular reforms in the 1920s forced many of its leaders into exile. Throughout the interwar period, Albanian intellectuals and reformers sought to harmonize Islamic tradition with Western modernity. Journals such as Zani I Nalta, The High Voice, published debates about Islam's role in education, women's rights, and progress. The tone was reformist, not reactionary, a desire to present Islam as compatible with Enlightenment ideals rather than an obstacle to them. This intellectual balancing act produced a unique form of identity: Albanian first, Muslim second. It did not reflect a loss of faith, but rather a pragmatic understanding of Albania's geopolitical position. In a Europe dominated by Christian powers and nationalist ideologies, Albanians sought to assert their belonging through culture rather than creed. Even today, this identity continues to define the Albanian worldview. Surveys conducted by Pew Research Center, 2024, indicate that while approximately 58 to 60% of Albanians identify as Muslim, only a minority describe themselves as actively religious. Instead, Islam functions as a cultural framework, shaping family values, moral codes, and communal solidarity, more than as a rigid system of ritual. This synthesis between religion and nationalism allowed Albania to navigate the turbulent 20th century without descending into sectarian conflict like many of its Balkan neighbors. It helped preserve national unity during wars, occupation, and dictatorship, giving Albanians a sense of shared belonging beyond theological difference. Yet this balancing act came at a cost. Religion, in its institutional form, became subdued, a quiet part of identity rather than its centerpiece. By the mid-20th century, as the world moved toward ideological extremes, this secular nationalism would be tested to its limits. The faith that had endured empires and revolutions was about to face its most severe trial under a new regime that sought to erase God altogether. Still, in the decades that followed, the Albanian experiment, blending Islam, secularism, and nationalism, stood as a distinctive European model. It demonstrated that faith could coexist with modernity, and that Islam could form part of a national identity not defined by theological exclusivity, but by shared history and cultural continuity. In Albania, Islam did not vanish behind the rise of nationalism. It adapted, quietly, resiliently, shaping a society that was Muslim in heritage, European in spirit, and proudly Albanian above all else. When World War II ended, Albania entered one of the darkest and most paradoxical chapters in its history. In 1944, under the leadership of Enver Hoxha, the country fell under a rigid communist regime that would last nearly half a century. What began as a promise of national liberation and modernization soon transformed into an experiment in total ideological control, one that sought not merely to reform religion, but to eliminate it entirely. From the outset, Hoxha's vision for Albania was rooted in Stalinist isolationism and militant atheism. The regime viewed religion, Islam, Orthodoxy, and Catholicism alike as remnants of feudalism and imperial domination. For Hoxha, true progress required severing Albania's ties to its religious past, especially its Ottoman Islamic heritage, which he regarded as an obstacle to socialist modernization and national unity. By the late 1940s, religious leaders across all faiths faced surveillance, imprisonment, or execution. The state seized mosques, churches, monasteries, and madrasas, converting them into warehouses, military barracks, or cultural centers. In 1967, following China's Cultural Revolution as a model, Hoxha declared Albania to be the world's first atheist state. This was not a symbolic statement, it was an absolute decree. The new constitution outlawed all forms of religious practice and affiliation. Within months, more than 1,200 mosques and 530 churches were closed or destroyed. The Ethem Bey Mosque in Tirana, one of Albania's most iconic Ottoman structures, was shut down and placed under state control. Imams and priests were arrested, tortured, or sent to labor camps. The Quran and other sacred texts were banned, and possession of religious material became a criminal offense. Religious names for children were prohibited, and public expressions of faith, even simple acts such as fasting or prayer, were treated as political dissent. This campaign went far beyond persecution. It was a systematic attempt to erase memory. The communist government rewrote textbooks, replacing religious history with ideological propaganda. Islamic architecture was whitewashed or demolished, while Ottoman heritage was depicted as an era of foreign oppression. The Albanian language, already reformed during the interwar years, was further stripped of Arabic and Persian loanwords, erasing linguistic traces of its Islamic past. Generations grew up with no access to religion. By the 1970s, an entire population had been raised under the belief that God did not exist, that faith was superstition, and that loyalty to the party was the only sacred duty. Religious holidays such as Ramadan, Eid al-Fitr, and Eid al-Adha disappeared from the national calendar, replaced by Days of the Worker and revolutionary youth festivals. The state promoted a new kind of spiritual order, one centered on Enver Hoxha himself, whose portraits replaced icons in homes and public buildings. Yet, despite decades of repression, Islam did not vanish completely. In rural areas and small towns, faith survived quietly, not in mosques, but in memory and ritual. Families continued to whisper prayers over meals, recited fragments of the Quran remembered from elders, and preserved circumcision and burial rites as cultural customs rather than explicit religious acts. In some regions, the Bektashi Sufi orders, long known for their adaptability and spiritual symbolism, maintained a covert existence, passing down oral teachings through trusted disciples. This underground faith was not one of theology, but of endurance, an act of cultural resistance against the totalitarian state. The secrecy surrounding it gave rise to what scholars now describe as cryptic religiosity, a form of belief sustained not by institutions, but by emotion, nostalgia, and the human need for transcendence. By the 1980s, as the regime began to weaken under economic strain and political isolation, cracks began to appear in this enforced atheism. Despite surveillance, small groups began gathering in private homes to pray or commemorate Islamic festivals. These early, quiet gestures signaled the persistence of an identity that could be suppressed but not erased. When Hoxha died in 1985, Albania remained one of the most isolated countries in the world, cut off even from other communist states. But his death marked the slow unraveling of a system that had tried to replace faith with ideology. When communism finally collapsed in 1991, what emerged from beneath the ruins was not a population entirely divorced from religion, but one hungry for spiritual renewal. The decades of enforced atheism left deep scars. A generation of Albanians had grown up disconnected from their religious vocabulary, traditions, and theological understanding. Yet, paradoxically, the same repression had also purified faith from political entanglement. What survived was not the formal structure of Islam, but its essence, a quiet remembrance of God preserved in private hearts. In retrospect, the communist era represents not only the eradication of organized religion, but also a profound test of cultural identity. Albania became the only nation in history to outlaw belief entirely. And yet, when the ban was lifted, Islam re-emerged almost instinctively, as though it had been waiting beneath the silence. By 2025, historians and sociologists continue to study this period as a rare social experiment, one that reveals both the fragility and resilience of faith. For Albania, the years of erasure did not destroy Islam. They transformed it into something quieter, more personal, and deeply ingrained in the moral fabric of its people. Faith had gone underground, but it had never died. When the communist regime collapsed in 1991, Albania emerged from nearly 5 decades of isolation, poverty, and ideological control. What the world saw was a country spiritually hollowed out, a nation that had outlawed belief for 2 generations. But beneath the surface, the embers of faith still glowed. With the end of Enver Hoxha's dictatorship came the restoration of religious freedom, and with it, a long-suppressed spiritual revival that would reshape the nation's identity in the decades to come. The first signs of this awakening were both symbolic and deeply emotional. In early 1991, thousands of Albanians gathered in Skanderbeg Square in Tirana to demand the reopening of the Ethembe Mosque, which had been closed since 1967. When its doors finally opened, men and women wept openly, not out of nostalgia for the past, but out of relief that public worship had become possible once again. It was a collective act of remembrance, signaling that faith, though buried, had survived. Within months, mosques and churches across the country were being restored. Many were little more than ruins, their minarets destroyed, their walls used for storage or livestock during the communist years. Communities organized volunteer efforts to clean, repair, and reopen these spaces of worship, often with limited resources but immense devotion. Central to this process was the re-establishment of the Muslim community of Albania, Komuniteti Musliman I Shqiperisë, KMSH, which had been abolished under communism. Revived in 1990, KMSH became the official representative body of Albanian Muslims, overseeing religious education, mosque reconstruction, and relations with the international Islamic world. The organization faced the daunting task of rebuilding an entire religious infrastructure from the ground up, including the training of imams, the reintroduction of religious schooling, and the restoration of trust in institutions. Foreign assistance soon arrived. Turkey, leveraging historical and cultural ties through the Ottoman legacy, became one of the earliest and most influential partners in Albania's Islamic revival. The Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency, TIKA, funded mosque restoration projects, educational programs, and cultural exchanges. The Diyanet, Turkey's Directorate of Religious Affairs provided scholarships and theological training for Albanian students, helping to re-establish the intellectual foundations of Islam in the country. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and Qatar offered financial and humanitarian aid, funding the construction of new mosques, Islamic schools, and welfare organizations. Institutions such as the Saudi-based Islamic Development Bank and the Qatari Red Crescent contributed to rebuilding both infrastructure and social services. However, these relationships also introduced debates over influence, particularly regarding the spread of conservative interpretations of Islam that contrasted with Albania's traditionally moderate and Sufi-inflected practice. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Albania witnessed the rise of new madrasas and Islamic universities, including the Beder University College in Tirana, established in 2011 under KMSH's supervision. These institutions aim to combine theological study with modern education, producing a new generation of scholars who could navigate both religious and secular worlds. Social and charitable organizations also re-emerged as pillars of Islamic life. The humanitarian foundation Miracia, among others, focused on poverty alleviation, education, and disaster relief, reviving Islam's emphasis on social justice and community care after decades of enforced materialism. Yet as Albania opened itself to the global Islamic community, questions of identity and authenticity became increasingly central. Many Albanians, especially the post-communist youth, began asking, what does it mean to be a Muslim in Europe? Was Islam to be rediscovered through Arab or Turkish models, or could it reconnect with its own distinctly Albanian roots, shaped by centuries of coexistence, tolerance, and pluralism? These questions reflected deeper cultural tensions. While foreign support accelerated reconstruction, some scholars and local clerics worried that it risked importing foreign ideologies into a country where Islam had always been inclusive and harmonized with local customs. The government, wary of extremism, maintained strict oversight of religious activities, ensuring that Albania's secular constitution remained intact. By the mid-2000s, this balance began to stabilize. The post-communist generation, now educated, urban, and globally connected, embraced a form of Islam that was less about politics and more about personal ethics, spirituality, and cultural belonging. Surveys by the European Council on Foreign Relations, 2024, indicate that while over 58% of Albanians identify as Muslim, the majority view religion as compatible with democracy and modern European values. This revival, therefore, was not a return to the past, but a redefinition of faith in a post-atheist society. The Islamic Renaissance in Albania became both a reconstruction and a rediscovery, rebuilding the physical structures of religion while reawakening its moral and intellectual dimensions. In many ways, the story of Islam's revival in post-communist Albania mirrors the nation's broader transition, from isolation to openness, from repression to freedom, and from silence to rediscovered voice. By 2025, Albania stands as a unique case study in Europe, a country where Islam has re-emerged peacefully without sectarian conflict or political radicalization. It remains a faith shaped not by imported ideology, but by a distinctly Albanian spirit of moderation, resilience, and quiet devotion, the same spirit that once allowed it to survive half a century of erasure. In the modern era, Albania stands as one of Europe's most fascinating paradoxes, a Muslim-majority nation firmly aligned with Western political and military alliances. Since joining NATO in 2009 and pursuing European Union membership, Albania has navigated the delicate balance between its Islamic heritage and the secular democratic values demanded by Brussels. The Albanian state officially identifies as secular, but in practice, it operates as a model of interfaith coexistence. The Constitution guarantees full freedom of religion, and the government has emphasized neutrality toward all faiths. Yet, beneath this political framework lies a society still deeply shaped by its Muslim identity, not necessarily in ritual, but in culture, ethics, and social cohesion. Islam in Albania today is marked by moderation, tolerance, and a distinctly European character. Unlike parts of the Middle East or even the Balkans, where religion can divide, Albania's Islam tends to unite. It is often described as cultural Islam, a faith woven into family values, hospitality, and moral codes rather than strict dogma. In the decades after communism, Albanian Islam has undergone both revival and redefinition. Institutions like the Komuniteti Musliman i Shqiperisë, Islamic Community of Albania, or KMSH, have re-established mosques, schools, and social programs, but with careful awareness of Albania's geopolitical orientation. Turkish organizations, through the Diyanet and TIKA, have been key in rebuilding mosques and providing religious education. Meanwhile, Saudi and Qatari charities played a role in the 1990s and early 2000s, though their influence has waned as Albania aligns more closely with Western partners. Still, this balance remains fragile. Many Albanians see their Muslim identity as cultural rather than theological, a remnant of Ottoman heritage rather than a daily practice. Urban youth in Tirana, Durrës, or Shkodër often identify as spiritual but not religious, while rural areas maintain stronger communal observances, such as fasting during Ramadan or traditional Friday prayers. According to the Pew Research Center's 2024 Global Religion Survey, approximately 58% of Albania's population identifies as Muslim, making it one of the only Muslim-majority nations in Europe alongside Bosnia and Kosovo. Within that group, the majority are Sunni, while a significant minority follow the Bektashi Sufi order, an unorthodox mystical branch that has become a defining feature of Albanian Islam. The European Council on Foreign Relations, 2025, notes that Albania ranks among the most religiously tolerant nations in Eastern Europe. Mosques and churches often stand side by side, and interfaith marriages are socially accepted. Religious conflict is virtually absent, a legacy of both the communist suppression of sectarian divisions and a deep-rooted cultural ethos of coexistence. Yet Albania's position between East and West is not without tension. On one side lies the aspiration for European Union integration, requiring the demonstration of liberal, secular governance. On the other, a growing pride in Islamic identity connects Albanians with broader Muslim communities in the Balkans and beyond. The challenge is to preserve both, to remain European in structure, but spiritually tied to centuries of Islamic tradition. As of 2025, Albania continues to be cited in academic and diplomatic circles as a case study in post-communist religious reconstruction. It is a society where Islam thrives without dominating politics, where identity transcends dogma, and where faith quietly coexists with the secular ambitions of a European future. In 2025, Albania finds itself at a complex crossroads, not only between East and West, but between tradition and modernity, faith and secularism. The nation's Muslim majority continues to navigate the pressures of globalization, political realignment, and shifting cultural identity in a rapidly changing Europe. For young Albanians, especially in the urban centers of Tirana, Durrës, and Shkodër, religion has become more a question of identity than of daily observance. The post-communist generation, born into economic liberalization and digital globalization, often faces an inner tension: how to reconcile a Muslim heritage with the demands of modern European life. Youth integration is one of Albania's most pressing social issues. Surveys conducted by the Institute for Democracy and Mediation, 2024, indicate that while over 60% of young Albanians identify as Muslim, less than 20% engage regularly in religious practice. For many, Islam serves as a moral or cultural anchor rather than a religious system. The challenge lies in ensuring that this cultural Islam does not erode into spiritual emptiness amid the pursuit of Western modernity and material success. At the same time, Albania's growing middle class, fueled by foreign investment and tourism, has driven rapid secularization. Bars, Western fashion, and entertainment dominate city life, often in stark contrast to the conservative rhythms of rural areas. This has led to social fragmentation, where religious identity is quietly preserved in private spaces but rarely expressed in public life. Post-communist Albania embraced secularism as a safeguard against the totalitarianism of the past. Yet, some scholars and community leaders now warn of hyper-secularization, a cultural drift in which religion is not merely separated from the state, but also stripped from social consciousness. According to a 2025 report by the Albanian Academy of Sciences, this phenomenon is particularly visible in education, where religious studies remain absent from public schools, and youth often lack even basic knowledge of their Islamic heritage. Many Muslim parents express concern that modernization is being interpreted as detachment from tradition, resulting in a generation alienated from both faith and identity. Geopolitically, Albania continues to attract attention as a space of soft power competition between the European Union and Turkey. Turkish influence remains especially visible through institutions like TİKA, Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency, and Diyanet, which fund mosque reconstruction, provide scholarships, and promote Turkish-style religious education. While many Albanians welcome these initiatives as support for religious revival, critics argue that Ankara's growing presence risks importing political Islam into a society historically characterized by moderation. The government in Tirana, aware of EU sensitivities, has thus attempted to regulate foreign-funded religious activities while maintaining good diplomatic relations with Turkey. Meanwhile, the European Union continues to pressure Albania to uphold human rights and religious freedoms as prerequisites for accession. The EU Progress Report 2025 acknowledges Albania's exemplary interfaith harmony, but calls for clearer safeguards against external influence and more transparency in religious funding. Perhaps the most defining issue of 2025 is the transformation of Muslim identity itself. In contemporary Albania, being Muslim is increasingly seen as an ethnic or cultural marker rather than a theological commitment. The notion of the post-religious Muslim, someone who identifies as Muslim culturally but rarely practices, is becoming a social norm, particularly among urban youth and diaspora communities. This phenomenon reflects both continuity and change. On one hand, it preserves a sense of belonging rooted in history and family. On the other, it raises questions about the long-term vitality of Islamic institutions in a country where belief is often symbolic. The Komuniteti Misliman i Shqiperisë, KMSH, has responded by modernizing its outreach, using digital platforms, community programs, and interfaith events to reconnect younger generations with faith in a way that aligns with democratic values and scientific modernity. Today, Albania's Islam is neither under threat nor in decline. It is transforming. The current challenge is not one of extremism or repression, but of relevance. Can Islam remain meaningful in a nation that defines itself increasingly through European liberalism, digital capitalism, and global culture? The answer, as observers note, may lie in Albania's unique ability to blend worlds, to remain modern without abandoning memory, and to carry its Islamic soul quietly beneath the surface of a secular state. In 2025, Islam in Albania thrives not through institutions or politics, but in the ordinary rhythms of life, in how people help one another, celebrate together, and preserve their values amid modernization. For most Albanians, Islam is lived through kindness and social responsibility. Zakat and Sadaqah are practiced informally. Families support neighbors, fund local schools, and rebuild mosques. The Islamic Community of Albania, KMSH, and youth groups now organize structured charity programs in cities, reflecting a blend of faith and civic duty. Ramadan remains the most visible moment of faith. Even those who rarely pray fast together join iftar gatherings and share food with Christians and secular friends. In 2025, over 200 public iftar events across Albania reaffirm the country's spirit of inclusivity and interfaith harmony. Muslim women are increasingly active in education, media, and entrepreneurship. Wearing the hijab is now normalized in schools and workplaces. Organizations such as the Muslim Women's Forum of Albania support professional development while promoting a balanced, faith-based modern identity. In Tirana, Islam is often personal and flexible, practiced quietly amid a fast-paced digital lifestyle. In rural areas like Kukis or Berat, faith is communal and traditional, tied to daily prayer and local customs. Yet both share the same sense of belonging and moral continuity. The Hasanaj family in Tirana illustrates Albania's moderate Islam. They fast during Ramadan, celebrate Eid, and teach their children respect and generosity, the essence of their faith. As Arban Hasanaj says, Islam for us is not about rules, it's about remembering who we are. What does it mean to be Muslim in the heart of a continent built upon secularism, modernity, and the memory of Christendom? Albania offers one of Europe's quietest yet most profound answers. Here, Islam is not a challenge to European identity, it is part of it. In a land shaped by Ottoman rule, communist repression, and Western aspiration, faith has evolved not as an ideology, but as a form of balance. Albania shows that Islam and Europe are not opposing worlds, but overlapping histories. In the Albanian experience, Islam is peaceful, humble, and deeply human. It coexists with churches, schools, and markets. It blends prayer with daily work, tradition with progress. For centuries, this coexistence has endured, not because of power, but because of patience. To be Muslim in modern Albania is to embody quiet conviction amid modern doubt. It is to live faith without fear and to find meaning in moderation, neither rejecting the West nor romanticizing the East. As Europe faces its own crises of identity, immigration, secular fatigue, and cultural polarization, Albania stands as a mirror to an alternative path, a Europe where belief and reason, faith and democracy can coexist without contradiction. Thanks for watching until the end. I hope it was useful. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Yeah.